Every October since 2011, Retro Movie Geek has brought you the spooky side of retro movies. And this year is no different. So, a haunting we will go, as we dig up classic tales of ghosts and hauntings that are 20 years old or older. But remember, we spoil the hell out of every movie we cover. So consider yourself forewarned. Spooky Flix Fest starts now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nathan Bartlebaugh from the Phantom Galaxy podcast, and I'm joined by my co-host, Bill Van Vagel. And we are here as a part of Spooky Flix Fest 2023, the Supernatural edition for Retro Movie Geek. Joel Robertson asked us to submit a segment, and we're here tonight to talk about probably for a certain part of my growing up, a horror film I was aware of, but I had never actually seen until about maybe 20 years ago. I saw it for the first time, and honestly, when I rewatched it for this program, it was probably the first time I had seen it in about 10 or 15 years. So tonight's movie is 1963's The Haunting. And Bill, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well. I'm fighting a cold of some sort, but you know what? It's the time of year to do it. I'm healthy all summer. The moment I get back to school, I inject all of the germs. So everything's good.
It's like a Hoover. You just suck it all up.
Suck it all up. And I was also excited when Joel and Peter and Daryl invited us to do this because we've done it for a couple of years and we've always done some interesting films. And I just kind of plugged this film in and kind of said to Nathan, we're going to be doing The Haunting. And he was like, oh, cool, let's go. And
yeah, I think I had seen the spreadsheet with the movies and it was down to The Haunting. And I think maybe... I don't want to spoil it because someone else I'm sure has that movie, but another a low-key or maybe understated horror film, also in the realm of hauntings. And there's this movie, I think, and we can start talking about it in a moment. It has a very interesting pedigree. I think it is different than other horror films. It's probably closer to horror films that were being made in the 1960s, but I think it's a little bit unique in terms of the kinds of films you get today when we talk about hauntings.
Yes, I think this one is one that we mentioned in a previous chat where we said a certain age group, it might, I wouldn't say be lost on them, but it's not used to the current formulaic horror film they may be used to come Halloween time.
No, although I don't think that for some of you that's going to be a positive. And maybe for others not. But The Haunting is based off of The Haunting of Hill House, a novel by Shirley Jackson that was published in 1959. And Jackson's story, and it was a finalist for the National Book Award that year, Jackson's story kind of takes all of these elements that you would traditionally sort of expect to find in a ghost story. You have the great big looming mansion, that house is a character unto itself. There are strange and creepy, unexplained things that happen. You have a group of characters that come from disparate places all gathered together. You have one of them who's more sensitive to the happenings in the house than others. And of course, you have that really dramatic, dark, gothic backstory. So Shirley Jackson was taking a lot of things that people already associated with horror genre and mixing them together into a story that, Bill, we can probably talk about this in a few minutes, but I think the interesting thing about the novel is that at one point is absolutely a supernatural horror story, and you can read the novel as if everything in that book is actually happening. But Shirley Jackson layers on this kind of psychological narrative where the movie's really about a lot more than the ghosts, and maybe from one perspective, not about the ghosts much at all. Let me do a very quick summary here, and this is a summary for the adaptation, which is essentially the same story, but it differs in a couple of ways. And this was only a few years after the movie a few years after the novel was published. Robert Wise, who had just finished coming off of West Side Story, has picked up The Haunting and ends up making it into a film.
I was going to say, and Nathan, one thing before you got into the film, I wanted to bring about that one of the strengths of this film, and I've mentioned this multiple times, is how well it's shot. This is not a film that's shot on a shoestring budget by somebody who's just getting in there to film school. This was directed by Robert Wise. And those who are cinephiles will know Robert Wise has a history of quality productions in terms of what he's produced, including West Side Story, The Sound of Music, and genre fans will know Star Trek, the motion picture. So we're talking about somebody that understands angles, that understands shading and lighting and where characters need to be. And he's done films with action involved. So you kind of got to get yourself almost, at the best of Hammer, you're kind of in that realm of dark, haunted house shot by somebody who understands that the setting is a character unto itself.
Yeah, that's a good point you make about Robert Weiss, who in some ways, like you look at his career, and we have a lot of great filmmakers making films now, but I would say probably from the 70s on, you would get in, and even before, when someone like Hitchcock, a lot of times really great directors would have a very distinctive, specific style. You look at their film and you say, that's the work of a master. And of course, everyone else sort of falls into the journeyman category, right? A person who can kind of pick up and make great films or make good films and films that are crowd pleasers or blockbusters. But a lot of times it's not viewed that this person is maybe a master because they don't have a definitive style. Robert Wise is one of those guys who's made lots of great movies, great movies. A lot of the ones you mentioned. But on top of that, he made this, The Day the Earth Stood Still. He did The Sound of Music and West Side Story, and a ton of other movies in between. Born to Kill, the Run Silent, Run Deep, I Want to Live, and The Andromeda Strain, which I think you mentioned. But earlier in his career, really near the start of his career, he was making movies with Val Lewton. He made the sequel to The Cat People. He did The Curse of the Cat People, which is really a very different film than the original. And he also did one of my favorite Val Lewton movies, The Body Snatcher, with Boris Karloff. And as you and I are big Lewton fans, we've talked about Lewton on the podcast before, that was all theater of the mind. Everything that Val Lewton sort of did was theater of the mind, mostly because he didn't have the budget to do anything else. And so a lot of suggestion. So when Weiss makes this movie, he was specifically making it as sort of a tribute to the work he had done with Val Lewton. And I think it shows.
And I think it also goes to show another strength to this that I'm sure is a natural evolution is the quality of the cast and what the cast members bring to this. I mean, you've got Julie Harris, who in 1953, 10 years prior, was nominated for the movie Member of the Wedding for an Oscar. And she was in such films as East of Eden and Gorillas in the Mist. Like, she was in a lot of films, but she had a certain presence, and her understated presence, I think, brings a lot to this film. I mean, you've got Claire Bloom, and who was in a genre fans will know from Clash of the Titans, Crimes and Misdemeanors, and she was in a few episodes of the 2009 TV adaptation of Doctor Who. You've got Richard Johnson playing this, kind of reserved yet intelligent-looking doctor who's looking to figure out what's going on in this house and any supernatural activity. And he was in films such as Zombie. Yes, that Zombie. He was in the Monster Club. And in the 60s, he did a lot of really good period pieces, among them Khartoum, which is a very highly regarded film. And you've also got one of my favorite characters in the film, Russ Tamblyn. And Russ Tamblyn, I made a note later and almost comes in, not quite, but is almost a little bit of comic relief from time to time in this film. And he was in West Side Story. He was also in Twin Peaks, The Missing Pieces.
He was in the whole thing of Twin Peaks, and he came back. His character, Dr. Jacoby, comes back in Twin Peaks: Return, and I remember his whole gimmick was he was selling gold-plated shovels so you could shovel yourself out of the crap.
He was also in Django Unchained.
He was, yeah. Tamblin's been all over the place. He's always a fun guy to see.
I think he might even
films.
still be in. He might still have the odd occasional. He'd be probably late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, he still pops up from time to time.
Yeah. Only thing is, this is a 1963 film. It's not like he looks like he's 21 in this film either, you know?
No, but he does have that kind of puckish sort of demeanor. He's definitely the young guy. People wouldn't be surprised to find that when they remade this movie in 1999, they cast Owen Wilson in that role of Luke,
Right, yeah.
which sort of makes sense. So the plot of The Haunting, and I don't want to get too much into it because I think this is an experiential film. I think if you've heard of it and never seen it, or you've seen one of the other versions, this one is singularly different in a lot of ways. So I just want to give the basic setup. We have Dr. John Markway. That's the character who's played by Richard Johnson. We hear him talking at the very beginning of the film, and he is relating information, the backstory, the tragic backstory of Hill House that involves Hugh Crane, who was the patriarch who had the house built. And when he was bringing his new wife to the house, their carriage went off the road and she was killed instantly. His second wife died falling down the stairs. He was left with a daughter. And we have this whole tragic story that loops through. We get to the modern time, which would be 1960s in the context of the film, where Markway, who's doing a paranormal research on Hill House, wants to bring people, a group of people from different elements of the supernatural or the paranormal field, if you will, to help him in determining if there's real activity occurring in Hill House. So one of the people he pulls is Theo, who's a psychic. She's played by Claire Bloom, who was added to the cast because they were filming in London and they needed a British talent, so they got Claire Bloom. She's really good in the film. An interesting aspect of this is that Theo was presented in the novel in sort of implicitly as a lesbian. That is made a little more explicit, not in content, but in just the fact that it is mentioned, and there are elements of the dialogue that reference it from various characters. And there's a bit of tension between her and the other female character who comes into this, who's Eleanor Lance. Eleanor is probably one of the primary, she really would be the primary focal character of the story.
Yeah, if you're gonna say there's a main character, you might say.
Yeah, the story, a lot of the story is shot through her perspective. And in a moment, we'll talk about something that the screenwriter, as he was going through the novel, he happened onto a viewpoint or a reading of the film that probably makes Eleanor even more of a central character. But Eleanor had experience as a child involving a potential poltergeist. She also spent most of her life as an adult. She's now in her 30s and hasn't had much of a life because she was taking care of her invalid mother. Her mother died. She is now sort of just squatting in her sister's house. She calls this a vacation, but she's really sees it as a new opportunity. And she's probably the one who's most excited to be going to a haunted house. The fourth member of this group, beyond Markway and Theo and Eleanor, is the Russ Tamblyn character, who's Luke. And Luke is the nephew of Mrs. Sannerson, who's the person who has Hill House in her possession now. So when she agrees to let Markway do this, she's like, oh, well, you know what? You're going to have to let Luke come along as well. He's going to inherit all this. It would be good for him to see what's going on. And so he gets involved in that way. That may explain why Tamblyn's character is a little bit lighter, a little bit sillier, and doesn't seem to be taking things as seriously as the rest. You mentioned It seems like he's at a dinner party.
He's at a dinner party for cocktails.
Yeah, there's a point when they're looking at the statues in the outside in the garden, and they're pretending to dance with them, and he screams, "Ow!" She stepped on my foot or something.
Yeah.
You get a lot of that throughout the film. Once they're all together, though, I think what is interesting is at this point, the movie is left open to have a lot of character conversations, a lot of interaction. We see Markway enamoring himself to Eleanor. Eleanor is becoming sort of infatuated with him. We already know that Markway has a wife, but he seems to be playing all these angles for the good of the research. Theo seems to get a little prickly when she sees Markway kind of moving in on Eleanor, and she may have sights on Eleanor as well. Except the relationship becomes very, very, biting. She becomes kind of nasty towards Eleanor. She's definitely a far more sarcastic and sort of prickly presence in this film than she is in the book. And I think that's to create a foil, so there's more tension and gives Eleanor came from a place where she was an outsider, and she's coming into this as an outsider as well. The only truly warm presence is Markway, and we're not sure we can trust him because we know that he seems to be leading her on, and not just in the area of this potential relationship, but in the fact that she seems the most susceptible to the paranormal activity.
But Markway himself is pretty dodgy because
he is. We don't know what his
we don't know
real
his
intention is.
We don't know his motivations. He seems to hold certain things back. He does just enough to further the plot and to get the characters to do what he wants them to do.
Yes, and then you get to the hauntings themselves, the actual supernatural activity, which is so
I was going to say subtle, shall we say?
subtle. Yeah, subtle is good. It's things that happen when people aren't looking or out of the corner of your eye. Every piece of supernatural activity that they experience early on in the film could absolutely be the work of someone of human hands. There's no, at least early on, there's no question about it.
I was going to say, you kind of get a William Castle feel at the beginning.
You do. House on Haunted Hill, is the campier sort of version of what was done with Hill House. But what makes Hill House, The Haunting, so compelling is that it doesn't go that way. It doesn't rely on cheap tricks. In fact, it has a lot of really outstanding technical value in the way that the film is shot, the way it looks. As you were pointing out, it's a gorgeous looking film. It's not just a gorgeous looking film, it has a real personality and identity. I don't think there were many horror films, haunting horror films at the time that The Haunting comes out, that took that concept of the house has a personality. The house is insane. The house is where all of the activity ushers forth from. Even movies
I was going to say, it harkened me back to this old dark house.
Yeah, except in the old dark house, even in the old dark house, it's the people inside the house that are problematic. In The Innocents, probably my all-time favorite ghost story, that it's the children, it's the governess, right? It's those characters that previously inhabited the house. These are places being haunted. In The Haunting, the house seems to have kind of sucked in all the psychological misery and is doing the haunting itself. And I think that the way this movie looks, there's that staircase, that spiral staircase is one of the really cool set pieces in the entire film.
There is a screw that's barely holding on.
Yeah, this kind of stuff done and it's funny, when they did the remake, they completely mishandle that scene. They have the focus on the wrong person in the sequence. Visually, it's a lot of CGI. And here, it's expertly done. We have the camera sort of racing around the staircase, and we have these forced perspectives that are fascinating. I mean, they look like potentially the work of Hitchcock.
I mean, you're literally holding your breath because Richard Johnson's probably about 6 feet, 220 pounds. I mean, he's an average sized guy. But when you're doing that and you've got a quarter of an inch hooked into the wall, you're holding your breath.
Yeah, it's one of the great scenes in a horror film like this, really in any kind of suspense film. And a lot of it's achieved with some very interesting camera work. And there's a specific camera actually that this Panavision wide angle, it was a 30 millimeter that Weiss was using, and it wasn't technically ready. It was causing distortions. He had to sign something to say, hey, I know the lens is not right. But he used that, and he worked with the cinematographer, Davis Bolton, the cinematographer, to keep the camera moving through these scenes. And so, again, we have that sense of personality. The house has a very distinct presence. I think that makes all the difference, because then what Weiss does is he allows a lot of the rest to be conversations between these various characters. And we see them sort of unraveling upon each other. And he never really, for a film that is a horror film, he never really allows us to grasp onto anything concrete. I think one of the creepiest scenes in the entire film deals with the fact that Eleanor believes she's holding someone's hand, and she may not be holding anyone's hand. It's a very, very low-key thrills, but I think they really work, and they work because of this gothic structure that Shirley Jackson has given them. I don't want to say too much more. I'll let you talk first, Bill, but how do you think this ultimately holds up as a movie? I know I hadn't seen it in a long time.
I think it holds up fairly well. To pull the veil back a little bit, I hadn't seen this in many years. It'd probably been at least 10 years. This is one of those circumstances where I read the book first. I read the book first back in university, and then I watched it, shortly thereafter, just to see what the differences are. And then I probably watched it, 10 years later. And then I probably haven't seen it since about I don't know, 2005 or so. So it's been a while. So I quite liked it. I will say it starts. I like the setup. I really, really like how they set up the characters, and it makes you want to keep watching. It starts, and then it kind of devolves into a psychological horror. If that's not your bag, this might not be your film. It's playing in the minds of the characters, particularly Julie Harris, because we get the backdrop that she's been looking after her mom for so many years. She hasn't had the chance to get out and be a teenager and have fun. So she's taking this as her trip to get out of this world, She's probably in her early to mid 30s by now, but this is her big chance to go outside of the city. And you're not sure how she's able to adjust. And as the film goes on, you see her devolve and devolve. And the questions arise, is it supernatural? Is it her psychological state? Is it a combination thereof? Is there a reason? Because as the film goes on, she gets edgier and testier and less predictable. And I think you want to watch to try to figure out what's going to happen in this film, because it becomes very paranoid. You get claustrophobic, and the tension is slowly ratcheted up. The suspense is totally ratcheted up. What didn't hold it for me as much, and I know this didn't bother Nathan as much as it did me, is be prepared. There are long stretches of time. There might be 7, 10, 12 minutes where very little happens. There's an interplay of dialogue where you kind of get some clues about the house and character motivations and their internal thoughts. But this is not a wham bang look for an excitement on your move film. You kind of have to wait and make your judgment up at the end. Is the payday worth it for you? And if it is, then it is. If it isn't, I'm not going to change your mind. So an overall grade, I gave this one a 7.5. Very good, but it doesn't always get things going. And that's my only criticism.
Yeah, I did like this one a lot more. I see where you're coming from on that, Bill, and I know there are people who maybe view the film as a little bit slower. But then the question you always have is compared to what? Because I do think in the realm of supernatural films, particularly films that involve ghosts, I think that the great films do tend to be movies that take their time, that build, even when they're lodged full of special effects. A movie like Poltergeist comes to mind. Poltergeist still has a very deliberate build-up. It gets pretty histrionic, and I wouldn't call anything in that film particularly subtle. It's even a movie like The Shining, which is really all atmosphere and very little of traditional plotting, has that sense of you could make the case that there's maybe not a lot going on. I think, and The Changeling comes to mind. In fact, this movie probably is a little bit closer, somewhere in the middle of The Innocents, which was a few years before this, and then The Changeling, made several years later. There's a lot of similarity in how the film is structured, which is there's a lot of space for us to become suspicious or intrigued by what we are or not seeing. I think what sets The Haunting apart is The Haunting is more minimalist than any of those films. At some point, there's got to be the money shot of something that is concretely supernatural. And we have a little bit of that in this film, but it's funny how low-key that is. But for me, I don't think this movie ever had any dull spots, but this is an adaptation of a novel. What Weiss has done is he's given the movie a lot of space, along with the screenwriter. He's given the movie a lot of space to allow us to infer certain things are going on, to have conversations. There's always something happening in this movie. It's just a lot of times it's happening on a level where we either don't perceive it yet or we don't know how to feel about it. And that gives a little bit more work on the part of the viewer. This isn't going to be your Conjuring where we kind of set up a row of things and they happen and we knock them down. This isn't a supernatural film where we clearly have, here are the investigators, here are the ghosts, and, are the ghosts going to be good? Are they going to be bad? The movie simply doesn't play that way. But I find it's a lot creepier because it doesn't give us that satisfaction. It doesn't give us that closure. It doesn't allow us to look at this story and sort of just sit outside of it. You kind of have to get invested. You get invested in the Julie Harris character. You get invested in the other characters. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but I think it's a beautiful template for a smarter kind of horror movie, a movie that's about ideas, that's about characters, and it gives you creepy atmosphere. I would take a lot of the scenes in this film where characters are reacting to something that may or may not be happening. I prefer that to, watching like 20, campers get slaughtered or something like that. But it is definitely a different kind of horror film than we're probably used to now. I don't think they make enough films like this. I think it's a very creepy movie, even though it is one that's going to play more in your mind.
I quite like the use of the narration and inner dialogue in this film.
Yeah, I think it's extremely well handled. And I think what it does is, at the end of the day, I didn't really sit there thinking, man, I wish I had seen insert supernatural activity. You know what I mean? I wish I had seen this. Like at the end of the film, there's some ambiguity, but I feel like it reaches a satisfying conclusion. And the way it's structured, and like you said, the narration is smartly handled. It has a purpose for being. We are left in the dark about a lot of different character motivations. I give this one a 9.5. It's very close to being a 10 in my book. You are right in the sense that there are some scenes that are probably stretched longer than they need to be, but it works for the tone of the film. I was never taken out of it. The last thing I want to say, we had two other versions of this. We had 1990. We've had other versions that weren't really called Hill House, but were sort of derived from it. Stephen King tried to make Hill House, and eventually what he came to, he was trying to do it with Steven Spielberg, and they never agreed on it. And what they ended up with was Rose Red. It's interesting. It doesn't resemble a lot of Hill House. The Haunting came out in 1999, and that was directed by Jean de Bond, who did Twister. And it is almost like an anathema to everything that Shirley Jackson was trying. It's Liam Neeson, Catherine Zeta-Jones. Lily Taylor's really good as Eleanor. Owen Wilson plays Luke. They've got all the pieces there, but then they just fill it to the brim with CGI. This is the movie. This is the post-Poltergeist version of The Haunting. And I won't say it's a terrible film, but it looks like you're watching something that really could have been, we've had a few attempts to do Disney's Haunted Mansion. The final film of the Haunting from '99 looks more like a Haunted Mansion movie. Has some great set design, but really there's not a lot else going on in that movie. And this one has none of those theatrics and histrionics, but it is pound for pound creepier in almost every possible sequence because of that theater of the mind aspect. And then this was the basis for the miniseries that Mike Flanagan did, The Haunting of Hill House, which it's interesting because there's a scene in this movie where these people who've all been brought together by Markway are staring at these statues, and they start kind of playing this game of, hey, this is almost like us. This could be a family. And I think they say that Tamblyn will be the dog, but they're going through and they're identifying like, well, you could be Crane. The interesting thing about that is that's exactly what Flanagan does. He makes the Cranes a family. Hugh Crane is still the patriarch, but the Cranes come back as a family, a haunted family, to deal with what's going on in the house. And all those characters are now seen through a different prism. I think that is maybe the best version of this story. This one is so close to what Jackson was actually doing, though, that I think it deserves a special place for being able to set a tone and set a trend for a certain kind of horror movie that still persists today, that psychological, supernatural story. You've got a person who is psychologically unhinged, and you may also have supernatural activity, and one doesn't preclude the other. Lots of times we see stories where they have to come down on a side, but you know what? If there can both be ghosts in this house, and she can also be crazy.
Yeah, you're kind of left with in your own interpretation, however you see it. It's not going to be a wrong answer. It's just going to be, everybody's going to have their own version.
So I think it's a wonderful movie to show at to Halloween. And here's the other thing about it. This is a G-rated horror film, which is almost amazing to believe. But you can show it to younger audiences. This is where they are going to need to be patient. You don't want to watch this and some really loud jump scare movie. Don't show them the jump scare movie first, because they may not, they may have a harder time getting into this one. But I do think this is a horror movie potentially for everybody, but it is going to be maybe different than what you're expecting if all you've seen are sort of supernatural films post Poltergeist or post The Ring.
This is not Hereditary.
Well, in a lot of ways, a film like Hereditary is a lot closer to The Haunting than it is The Conjuring.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, if anything, those Ari Aster movies, I think Ty West, you look at The Innkeepers and House of the Devil, a lot of his work owes a lot more to stuff like The Haunting and the films of Val Lewton.
So I think it's a film worth watching. I think if you've never seen it, please do. If you're a cinephile, if you're someone who loves the history of horror, someone who likes scary haunted house type atmospheric films, if you kind of like some of those mid-60s Hammer films, give this a check. Or if you kind of like a spooky, scary house film, give this a check. It gives my thumbs up.
Yeah, and to me, this is a buy. And there's a very nice, I think Warner Brothers has a very nice Blu-ray of it out that you can pick up for pretty cheap. I picked it up to rewatch it for the show. So yeah, 9.5 for me, 7.5 from Bill. And everyone, you have Phantom Galaxy, at the time you're hearing this, is now officially back. We're starting our new season. I'm glad to be back with Bill, and we'll be getting this regular stuff out. We will have stuff as well for Halloween for the October season. And you can find me also over at Horror Movie Podcast with where I'm podcasting regularly with Trey Whetstone and Victor Rodriguez and Matt Rawlings, who kind of restarted everything with HMP. He joins us from time to time, as does his son Jackson. And Bill was also over there as well. Bill does the Terror on Tubi.
Tubi Terrors.
Tubi Terrors, Bill. Yeah. And then, of course, Bill, you were also on Land of the Creeps.
Yeah, check me out at Land of the Creeps with Greg and Dave and Pearl. We'd love to have you listen to us.
Yeah. So, again, Joel, thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of...
Peter, get out of the closet. Daryl, give him crap. Joel, survive yourself in Florida.
So thank you again for having us. Again, you can find us at Phantom Galaxy, really anywhere where podcatchers catch podcasts. And you can find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page there, and we're on Twitter as well at PhantomCast. So until next time, have a great spooky Flix Fest.
Thank you for listening. Get all the spookiness you can handle this October by subscribing to Mom and Pop Video Shop on YouTube. You can also find Retro Movie Geek on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you dig up your podcasts. The spooktastic music you heard at the beginning and end of this episode was provided courtesy of Ed and Gavin and their band, Midnight Syndicate. We want to thank them for the use of music from their albums Gates of Delirium and The 13th Hour. Want to sink your ghostly claws into this and all Midnight Syndicate's beautifully macabre music? Then go to midnightsyndicate.com. And remember, spooky is as spooky does.